The bottle was ripped from her hands before she could finish her sentence. Gasps shot through the cabin as the elderly black woman clutched her handbag tighter, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Please, that's my medicine," she whispered, her voice cracking against the silence. The attendant didn't pause, didn't care, disappearing toward the galley with the small bottle gripped like contraband. Every passenger felt the weight of it. This wasn't policy, this was cruelty unfolding in plain sight. Her chest rose unevenly, each breath harder than the last. For a woman who had survived so much, it was shocking to see her silenced by something as small as a pill bottle. Her neighbors in first class shifted in their seats, unsure whether to speak, unsure whether it was safe to challenge a uniform. Phones lifted discreetly. The hush in the cabin was no longer comfort, it was suffocating. Her fingers trembled as she reached again into her handbag. Not for the medicine that was gone, but for the only lifeline she had left, her phone. She scrolled clumsily, her sight blurred until one name filled the screen. She didn't speak. She only pressed the number, then handed the phone to the stranger beside her. The call connected. A low voice answered, calm, steady, powerful. The passenger's head turned slowly, eyes darting between the frail woman and the cabin crew who had dismissed her so easily. The voice on the line didn't shout. It didn't need to. Because this was not just anyone's mother. This was the mother of a man who could stop planes on the runway, reroute entire schedules, and bring billion-dollar deals crashing down with a single decision. And the crew had just made the mistake of crossing her. The man who rose to defend her? He wasn't just any man. He was her son. A billionaire with the power to silence an airline. If you're here with me right now, hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories like this one. And tell me in the comments, which country are you watching from? I love seeing where our community is tuning in. Her name was Evelyn Brooks. To the strangers on that flight, she might have seemed like just another elderly passenger, frail, soft-spoken, tucked neatly into her seat. But anyone who knew her story understood that every line on her face carried the memory of a fight. Every glance in her eyes reflected a generation that refused to bow, even when the world insisted they should. Evelyn was a widow, a mother, and a survivor of an era that tested her humanity at every turn. Born in the South during the thick of segregation, she had grown up under laws that told her where she could sit, what fountain she could drink from, and how low her head should bow. Yet she carried herself with a quiet dignity that could not be legislated away. Her spine remained straight, her voice steady, and her belief in her own worth unshaken. She had marched once, years ago, alongside neighbors who risked their jobs and their lives for the simple right to be seen as equal. She had been shoved off sidewalks, insulted in grocery stores, denied service in restaurants. And still, she walked forward, her faith her only shield, her family her reason to endure. Time had not erased those wounds. It had only taught her how to carry them without letting them crush her. Now in her 70s, Evelyn's battles looked different. Her body was slower, her joints stiff from years of hard labor. A small cluster of pills stood between her and the exhaustion that sometimes pressed against her chest without warning. Her doctor had been clear. Keep the medicine close, never miss a dose. For Evelyn, that bottle wasn't luxury. It was life itself. She had packed it carefully the night before, slipping it into the side pocket of her handbag where she could reach it quickly if her heart began to falter. It had traveled with her on buses, in church basements, even to her weekly volunteer work at the library. Never once had anyone dared to question her right to it, not until now. And why was she traveling that day? To see her first great-grandchild. Her grandson had welcomed a baby girl weeks earlier, and the family had begged her to come meet the newest branch of their tree. Evelyn, ever cautious about her health, had hesitated. But love outweighed fear. She booked the ticket, dressed in her best church outfit that morning, and told herself it would be worth the discomfort to hold that baby in her arms. The seat in first class wasn't hers by accident. It was a gift, a gesture from her son who wanted her to be comfortable, who wanted her to feel the kind of respect she had long been denied in public spaces. Sitting there was meant to be a reminder that her sacrifices had not been in vain, that her family's success was rooted in the soil she had watered with tears and perseverance. And so, when the flight attendant stripped away her medicine, what the others saw as a single act of rudeness struck Evelyn as something far heavier. It was the echo of every restaurant door slammed in her face, every job she'd been denied, every time her voice was dismissed because of the color of her skin. She wasn't just being told her medicine wasn't allowed, she was being told she wasn't allowed. Her eyes welled with tears, but not from weakness. They came from fury. She had survived too much, endured too many battles to be cast aside so easily. She had fought too long, the thought burned inside her, to be dismissed so easily. The jet bridge smelled faintly of recycled air and cleaning chemicals, the kind Evelyn had learned to ignore after years of travel. She stepped carefully, one hand on her handbag strap, the other tracing the railing as she moved toward the cabin door. Her gait was slow but deliberate. People behind her shuffled impatiently, but Evelyn offered a polite smile as she let the attendant at the door scan her boarding pass. "First class, ma'am," the gate agent said, though without much warmth. The scanner beeped, the kind of sound that should have been routine, but Evelyn caught the attendant's raised eyebrow as if her very presence there was unexpected. It wasn't the first time she had seen that look. Surprise, sometimes irritation, at someone like her walking into spaces where society once told her she didn't belong. Inside the cabin, the difference was immediate. Leather seats stretched wide, each with pillows tucked neatly in place. Passengers in pressed suits and designer scarves were already reclining, drinks in hand. Evelyn eased toward her assigned seat, careful not to bump anyone's armrest. She set her handbag down gently, then pressed her knees into the seat's edge before lowering herself slowly. Every movement was deliberate, respectful, as if she were a guest in someone else's home. She murmured a greeting to the man seated across the aisle. He nodded without meeting her eyes. Another passenger brushed past with a faint sigh, as though waiting the extra moment for Evelyn to adjust had been an inconvenience. The first flight attendant approached moments later, checking the overhead bins. She glanced at Evelyn's handbag, sitting neatly under the seat in front of her, then gave a clipped nod and moved on without a word. Evelyn had asked nothing of her, only offered a small smile, but the dismissal was clear. No greeting, no acknowledgement. Just silence that stung sharper than words. When the drink service began before takeoff, the attendant paused at each row. Champagne for one, sparkling water for another, juice for the man in the window seat. When she reached Evelyn, she lingered just long enough to ask, "Anything?" Her tone was flat, her eyes already moving elsewhere. Evelyn hesitated, then asked softly, "Just some water, please." The attendant didn't respond. She scribbled on her notepad, pivoted, and walked away. Minutes passed, trays were delivered, glasses clinked. Evelyn sat with dry lips, her request forgotten. It wasn't the water itself that mattered. It was the message. Others were worth serving promptly, she was not. Evelyn folded her hands in her lap, pressing her thumb into her palm to keep from showing hurt. She had lived long enough to recognize the tactic. Small slights, easy to deny, brushed off as accidents, but repeated just enough to remind you of your place. She thought back to her younger years when waitresses ignored her order, when store clerks pretended not to see her waiting at the counter. Those were the same kinds of wounds, invisible to some, unforgettable to those who carried them. The cabin lights dimmed as passengers settled. The captain's voice droned through the speakers, promising a smooth flight and clear skies ahead. Evelyn rested her head back, closing her eyes for a moment, but the unease lingered. The same attendant passed again, collecting stray cups. Evelyn straightened in her seat, thinking perhaps she'd bring the water now. Instead, the uniform swept by without so much as a glance. A younger man across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, watching the exchange. He opened his mouth as though to speak, then thought better of it. His gaze dropped back to his phone. Evelyn caught the flicker of shame on his face, not for her but for himself. The weight of being overlooked pressed harder with each passing minute. And yet Evelyn remained poised, shoulders back, chin lifted slightly, eyes forward. Her dignity was her armor, even when she felt the sting of disregard cut deep beneath it. It started with small slights, a missing glass of water, a dismissive look, a silence where kindness could have lived. But the smallest cuts often bleed the deepest. The plane had settled into its climb, engines steady, seatbelt signs glowing above each row. Evelyn shifted slightly, reaching into her handbag to check that her bottle of medicine was still within reach. She touched it the way someone touches a rosary, not out of habit, but out of need. That was when the flight attendant reappeared. Her eyes flicked to Evelyn's lap, then to the handbag. She leaned down, her voice sharper now than it had been during boarding. "What's in the bottle?" Evelyn blinked, confused by the question. "It's my prescription," she answered softly. "For my heart. I keep it with me at all times." The attendant didn't move on. Instead, she straightened, crossing her arms. "You can't have unsealed medication on this flight. That's against policy." Whispers stirred nearby. A man in a business suit lowered his tablet. A woman clutching a toddler glanced over with furrowed brows. Evelyn's hands tightened over the bottle. "It's prescribed," she repeated, slower this time as if explaining to a child. "My doctor requires me to take it. I have the paperwork in my bag, if you'd like to see it." The attendant's face hardened. "Ma'am, I don't need paperwork. What I need is for you to hand it over. Passengers aren't allowed to carry unauthorized substances." Her words cut through the air like a slap. Unauthorized. As though Evelyn were smuggling poison, not clutching the pills that steadied her heart. A younger flight attendant hovered a few rows back, watching but saying nothing. Evelyn looked up at the uniform towering over her, her voice trembling but still respectful. "Please, I am 72 years old. I cannot risk being without this medicine." "Ma'am, you need to cooperate," the attendant barked, now loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "Hand it over, or we'll have a problem." The passengers stirred. One man muttered under his breath. Another woman shook her head, whispering, "That's not right." Phones began to rise, screens glowing as recordings quietly started. Evelyn saw them, but shame outweighed relief. To be filmed in her frailty, her dignity stripped away. It was a humiliation she never asked for. With trembling hands, she lifted the small bottle from her handbag. The pills rattled softly, the sound almost drowned by the engines. She extended it forward, hoping compliance would end the ordeal. The attendant snatched it, lips pressed thin. She glanced at the label, but didn't bother to read it. With a shake of her head, she turned, marched down the aisle, and dropped the bottle into a trash bag, swinging from her other arm. The sound was muffled, but for Evelyn, it might as well have been glass shattering. Gasps erupted around her. A passenger in the row behind whispered angrily. She threw it away. Someone else hissed, "That's medicine." The woman with the toddler clutched her child tighter, her eyes wide with disbelief. Evelyn's chest tightened, not just from the missing pills, but from the weight of the insult. It wasn't just her medicine that had been tossed aside. It was her voice, her years, her right to exist with dignity. Her hands trembled in her lap, twisting the fabric of her skirt. She forced her gaze down, unwilling to let the tears slip past her lashes. But the pressure built, the humiliation burning hotter with each passing second. The attendant strode back up the aisle, ignoring the whispers, ignoring the phones recording her every move. She didn't so much as glance at Evelyn, as if the woman she'd just stripped of safety and dignity were invisible. The silence afterward was suffocating. Evelyn could feel every set of eyes, every thought buzzing in the heads of strangers who witnessed what had just unfolded. Her body shook, not from illness but from the memory of decades past. The restaurants that turned her away, the bus seats she wasn't allowed to claim, the clerk who once laughed in her face when she dared to ask for service. She had endured them all, always holding her head high. But at that moment, it felt as though history had come full circle, cruelly reminding her that for some, her worth would never measure up. A businessman in the row ahead leaned slightly, whispering, "That's not allowed. She can't do that." His words carried no volume, no conviction. He didn't stand, he didn't challenge. Evelyn pressed a hand to her chest. She knew her heartbeat was growing erratic. She tried to steady it with slow breaths, but the panic pressed closer. Her medicine was gone, and her dignity had been discarded with it. Her hands trembled, not from age, but from the weight of injustice. Evelyn sat stiff in her seat, her palms pressed flat against her skirt, the tremor in her hands refusing to subside. The bottle of pills, her lifeline, was gone. Each passing second pressed heavier on her chest, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat stumbling like a drum out of sync. She tried to focus on her breathing, but panic sharpened every breath into shards. The man across the aisle noticed her trembling. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, his voice hushed. Evelyn managed only a slight shake of her head. She could feel her pulse hammering against her temples, a warning she knew too well. Passengers shifted uneasily. A woman in the row behind leaned forward. "She doesn't look well," she whispered, her words meant to be private but carried by the still air. Another man raised his hand to catch the attendant's attention. When the uniformed woman returned, her expression carried irritation, not concern. "What's the issue now?" she asked briskly. "She needs her medicine," the businessman across the aisle said firmly. "You took it? She's clearly not okay." The attendant stiffened. "Sir, we don't discuss medical matters in the cabin. She's fine. If she were in distress, I'd know." Evelyn tried to speak, her lips parting, but only a breathless rasp escaped. The attendant leaned closer, lowering her tone just enough to let only Evelyn hear. "Stop exaggerating. You're making people uncomfortable." The words landed heavier than the pressure in her chest. Evelyn had lived her entire life hearing those dismissals. Exaggerating, overreacting, too sensitive. It was the language of those who refused to see her humanity. Her chest clenched again. The world around her blurred at the edges. She reached into her handbag once more, but the space where her medicine had been was hollow. She pulled out her phone instead, her fingers trembling so badly she nearly dropped it. The passenger beside her, a young woman in jeans and a sweater, steadied Evelyn's hand. "Do you need me to call someone?" she asked gently. Evelyn nodded weakly. With lips barely moving, she whispered one name. It was quiet, almost swallowed by the cabin noise, but the young woman leaned closer until she caught it. The name made her pause. She glanced at Evelyn, uncertain she'd heard correctly. "Are you sure?" she asked. Evelyn gave the smallest nod, eyes glassy but resolute. The young woman unlocked the phone and tapped the contact. The line clicked instantly, answered before the first ring had even finished. A deep voice spoke, calm but commanding. The young woman looked up, her face pale. She held the phone against her ear, glancing around the cabin. Passengers watched, tension growing thicker. Evelyn rested her head back against the seat, eyelids fluttering, the strain too much to bear. The businessman across the aisle leaned in, his voice low. "Who's she calling?" The young woman swallowed hard. "Her son." "And?" Her eyes flicked toward the front of the cabin, where the attendant stood stiffly, arms folded, pretending not to notice. The young woman's voice dropped to a whisper. "You'll see." The call was brief. The young woman relayed only the essentials. The medicine taken, Evelyn struggling, the crew refusing to act. The voice on the other end gave no outburst, no panic, just a firm command. "Stay with her. I'm coming." She ended the call and slipped the phone gently back into Evelyn's trembling hands. The elderly woman clutched it close to her chest, her breath shallow but steady enough to hold on. Around her, murmurs swelled. "That's unacceptable." How could they? She could collapse. Yet when passengers raised concerns again, the attendant dismissed them with icy finality. "Everything is under control," she said, though her voice betrayed a flicker of unease. Evelyn's body disagreed. Her hands shook harder, her chest rising in shallow bursts. Sweat dotted her forehead. She wasn't just uncomfortable, she was fading. The businessman reached across the aisle, covering her hand with his. "Hold on," he urged. "Help is coming." The young woman who'd placed the call whispered, "Your son knows. He's on his way." And that was when the atmosphere inside the cabin shifted. The passengers didn't know who he was yet. They only knew the way her name had carried weight, the way the call had been answered instantly, the way even in distress, Evelyn had summoned someone whose voice radiated power. The call had lasted less than a minute, but its echo lingered in the cabin like a silent verdict. Evelyn sat slumped in her seat, clutching her phone, while passengers whispered among themselves. None of them knew yet whose voice had just cut through the static, but they would soon learn. His name was Adrian Brooks. To the world outside, he was known as a billionaire investor, a disruptor who built his fortune in technology, expanded it in global finance, and used it to fund causes most companies were too timid to touch. He had been profiled on magazine covers, interviewed on news shows, celebrated for his vision. But to Evelyn, he was simply her only son. Adrian had grown up watching his mother endure indignities too small for headlines, but too sharp to forget. He remembered the night a waiter had refused to serve her coffee at a roadside diner. He remembered how she had walked him home from school with her head held high after a group of boys spat slurs in their direction. He remembered the quiet strength she carried, a strength that had raised him from modest beginnings into a man who controlled boardrooms filled with people who once would have dismissed him. Every success he claimed was rooted in her sacrifices. She had taken on 2 jobs to keep food on the table after his father passed. She had sewn his school uniforms by hand. She had sat at the back of parent meetings where no one greeted her, determined her son would never doubt his worth. Evelyn's resilience was the bedrock of his empire, and that was why Adrian Brooks was ruthless when it came to her protection. So when the phone vibrated in his pocket and the young woman's frightened voice explained what had happened, Adrian didn't hesitate. He was already near the airport, having just stepped off his private jet from a meeting in Dallas. His car swung toward the terminal with a single command to his driver: "Get me to gate 42, now." Inside the plane, the tension thickened. Evelyn's breathing was uneven, and the attendant continued to insist she was fine. Passengers argued softly, some raising their voices enough to be heard. One woman muttered, "This is unbelievable." Another passenger whispered, "She could die, and they're acting like it's paperwork." The captain's voice eventually broke through the intercom, steady but rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a slight delay as we finalize departure protocols. Please remain seated." But even that announcement carried hesitation. The captain had been informed that someone important, was at the gate demanding the flight be held. Captains didn't like delays, but this one knew his career might hang on what was unfolding. Adrian stepped through the private terminal entrance, his security detail flanking him. He wore no tie, only a tailored jacket over a dark shirt, his stride unhurried but firm. His presence alone turned heads as he cut across the polished floors. Airline staff at the gate stiffened. The gate manager attempted a polite greeting, but Adrian's expression silenced her before she could finish. "I want access to that aircraft," he said, voice low but unyielding. "Now." The manager stammered something about protocol, but the steel in his eyes dissolved her resistance. Within minutes, the jet bridge door unlocked, and Adrian walked down the narrow passage toward the cabin. Inside, passengers looked up as the cabin door opened again. Whispers rose instantly. His reputation preceded him, a man who had shaped markets, whose foundation had donated millions to rebuild schools, whose influence stretched across continents. Yet here he was, boarding not with the pomp of a celebrity, but with the cold purpose of a son summoned to defend his mother. The flight attendant who had tossed the medicine blanched. She tried to compose herself, but her voice cracked as she greeted him. "Sir, you can't be in here." Adrian cut her short with a glance. "Where is my mother?" Evelyn lifted her head slowly, her eyes softening as they landed on him. She whispered his name, and for the first time since the ordeal began, relief flickered in her gaze. Adrian knelt beside her seat, taking her hand. "Did they take it from you?" he asked gently. She nodded, her lips quivering but silent. He stood, turning to face the attendant. His tone was still calm, but it carried an authority that froze her mid-breath. "You threw away a prescribed medicine?" The attendant stammered. "Sir, it was against policy." Adrian's voice dropped lower. "No, it was against decency." Passengers murmured louder now, emboldened by his presence. Someone whispered, "That's her son?" Another replied, "Do you know who that is?" The captain emerged from the cockpit, his face pale. He had been briefed. He knew exactly who Adrian Brooks was, and for the first time in his career, he hesitated mid-announcement, unsure whether to speak as a commander of the aircraft or as a man staring down power far greater than his own. Adrian rose to his full height, his hands still steadying his mother's shoulder. The cabin had fallen into an uneasy silence, every passenger aware they were witnessing something that stretched far beyond an ordinary in-flight dispute. Evelyn sat upright, her frail dignity intact, refusing to let fear distort her composure. The contrast between mother and son was striking. Her silence spoke of endurance, his stillness radiated power. The lead flight attendant cleared her throat, summoning what authority she had left. "Sir, this is a matter of airline safety. Unsealed medication cannot be carried without proper clearance. It's written policy." Adrian's eyes didn't waver. "Policy is not a license for cruelty," he said evenly. "You stripped a 72-year-old woman of her prescribed medicine in front of an entire cabin. You left her gasping while you dismissed her health as an inconvenience." Murmurs swept the rows. A passenger in the back called out, "She told you it was prescribed." Another added, "We all saw what you did." The attendant's face reddened. She glanced toward the cockpit, as if hoping the captain would intervene. But the captain lingered at the doorway, arms crossed, his hesitation betraying the unusual weight of the moment. Adrian stepped into the aisle, his voice low but carrying to every ear. "I'm not here to debate policy. I'm here to remind you that my mother will not be humiliated on this aircraft." The attendant opened her mouth again, but Adrian cut through her words. You can explain policy to your lawyers when this is over. For now, listen carefully. If my mother does not fly today, then no one does." The cabin gasped collectively. Passengers exchanged looks, some wide-eyed with disbelief, others with the glimmer of admiration. Phones angled higher, capturing every second. One of the junior attendants whispered nervously, "Sir, please, you can't hold a flight hostage." Adrian's gaze flicked to her, calm but razor-sharp. "This flight is already hostage to your arrogance. You grounded it the moment you decided my mother's life was disposable." The captain stepped forward, his tone measured. "Mr. Brooks, I understand your frustration, but we cannot—" Adrian raised a hand, silencing him without raising his voice. "Captain, with all respect, your airline is on the verge of a public catastrophe. Half this cabin has already recorded your staff confiscating life-saving medicine. In a few minutes, it will be streaming live to millions. Do you really want your name attached to that?" The captain faltered, his jaw tightening. He had spent decades commanding respect with his uniform and voice alone. Yet standing before Adrian Brooks, he looked suddenly small. Evelyn reached for her son's arm, her fingers brushing his sleeve. "Adrian," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It wasn't a plea for him to stop, but a reminder of who she was, the woman who had taught him restraint as well as strength. Adrian softened, just for a heartbeat, before turning back to the crew. "She has lived through battles you will never understand. She deserves to meet her great-granddaughter without being treated like contraband. This flight does not move until that dignity is restored." The attendant attempted one last defense. "Sir, we were only following—" "Following what?" Adrian interrupted sharply. "A manual that tells you to throw away a black woman's prescription while serving champagne to the man in 2A? You confuse procedure with prejudice, and today, the world will see it for what it is." The cabin stirred again, louder now. A man near the front raised his phone, speaking for the first time. "He's right. I've been recording since you snatched that bottle. People need to see this." Another passenger added, "If she doesn't fly, I'm not flying either." A ripple of agreement spread through the rows. Evelyn closed her eyes, her lips trembling at the sudden swell of support. Adrian let the moment breathe, then delivered the final line like a verdict. "If my mother doesn't fly today, then no one does." The captain glanced at the crew, then at the cabin full of passengers now united in defiance. His authority was no longer absolute. The power had shifted, and it sat firmly in the hands of a son who refused to let his mother's dignity be discarded. The captain stood frozen at the front of the cabin, his hand still gripping the doorframe. He had faced engine failures, weather scares, and unruly passengers before, but never this. For the first time in his career, his authority was not the highest on the aircraft. Adrian Brooks' ultimatum echoed in the silent rows. "If my mother doesn't fly today, then no one does." The murmurs swelled. Passengers whispered to one another, some still clutching their phones, others raising them higher to capture the unfolding drama. The flight attendants huddled near the galley, their voices tense, trying to decide whether to escalate the situation or retreat. But the choice was slipping from their hands. The captain pressed the intercom button, his voice measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are temporarily delayed as we resolve an issue. Please remain in your seats." What he didn't announce was what the ground crew already knew. The flight had been officially grounded. Dispatch had informed him moments earlier after a string of frantic calls between the gate and the airline's operations center. The directive was clear: do not depart until further notice. Inside the operations hub, executives scrambled. Adrian Brooks' name had appeared on the report, flagged red. Within minutes, vice presidents and legal teams were pulled from conference calls. Phones rang non-stop. A senior manager barked into his headset, "Get me confirmation." "Is Adrian Brooks on that plane?" When the answer came back yes, silence filled the room before chaos erupted again. The word spread quickly across terminals. Billionaire grounds flight. Screens lit up in newsrooms as whispers reached journalists with sources at the airport. Within 20 minutes, the first posts appeared online. Blurry videos from passengers, captions hinting at an incident involving a black woman's medicine and her son, one of the wealthiest men in America. Back in the cabin, passengers were glued to their screens. Some watched the uploads in real time. "It's already on Twitter," a man muttered, turning his phone so his neighbor could see. Another passenger whispered, "It's on TikTok too. This is blowing up." The attendants noticed, panic flickering in their eyes. They whispered frantically among themselves, trying to maintain composure, but the tide had shifted. Every gesture, every word was under surveillance. Evelyn sat quietly, her posture regal despite the weight pressing on her chest. She leaned lightly against her son's arm, her eyes half closed, but her dignity intact. For decades, she had endured indignities in silence. Now, in her twilight years, strangers across the world would see her truth. Adrian stood near the aisle, calm and unmoving. His presence dominated the space without needing to raise his voice. "This plane is not leaving the ground until my mother's rights are respected," he said once more. This time not just to the crew, but to everyone listening. Passengers, captain, and the cameras aimed at him. The captain retreated into the cockpit, his headset already pressed to his ear. "Operations, this is Flight 237. Passenger is Adrian Brooks. Repeat, Adrian Brooks. He's demanding we hold the aircraft." The reply was curt. "You are grounded until executive leadership resolves this. Do not move." From his seat in the cockpit, the captain could see the tug vehicles being rolled away from the nose gear. The message was unmistakable. The aircraft wasn't going anywhere. Passengers shifted, realizing the scale of what was happening. A woman whispered, "We're part of history right now." A man behind her chuckled nervously. "Never thought I'd see one person stop an airline in its tracks." Someone else added, "Not just anyone, his mother." The whispers turned into quiet conversations. Some expressed frustration at the delay, but most voiced solidarity. "They disrespected her, and now they're paying for it," one passenger said. Another added, "Good. About time somebody with power stood up for this." Outside, news vans had already begun to roll toward the terminal. Reporters read from their phones as details trickled out. Anchors broke into scheduled programming with breaking banners. "Flight disruption involving Billionaire at airport." Inside the cabin, Evelyn opened her eyes, gazing at her son with quiet pride. Her voice was fragile, yet it carried strength. "Adrian, don't let them turn this against you." He knelt beside her once more, his hand covering hers. "They've already tried, Mama, but this time, the world is watching." A ripple of applause broke out in the back rows, hesitant at first, then stronger. The sound rolled forward, a rare chorus of strangers united by what they had witnessed. The lead flight attendant's face was ashen. She retreated to the galley, fumbling with her phone, no doubt reporting to her supervisors. But there was no way to undo what had already been seen, recorded, and shared. On the tarmac, the aircraft sat immobile, the bright afternoon sun glaring off its fuselage. To the outside world, it was just another delayed flight. To those inside, it was something far greater, a reckoning at 30,000 feet, still on the ground. Passengers leaned closer to one another, whispering a phrase that seemed to hang in the air like prophecy. "We're witnessing history." The aircraft remained parked on the tarmac, its engines cooling, its passengers restless but riveted. For those inside, it felt like time had slowed. For those outside, it felt like time had exploded. Within an hour of the incident, the story was no longer contained to the cabin. It was in boardrooms, on trading floors, and across millions of screens. The first headlines appeared online. "Billionaire grounds flight after mother's medicine tossed." "Elderly black woman humiliated by airline crew." News anchors repeated the words with astonishment, their voices carrying into living rooms nationwide. On social media, clips from passengers spread rapidly. Evelyn's trembling hands, the flight attendant's cold tone, Adrian's calm command that froze the cabin. Each video was shared thousands of times, captions dripping with outrage. In the airline's headquarters, panic churned through the executive suite. The CEO was pulled from a quarterly strategy meeting and handed a tablet with live feeds. He watched in silence as Adrian Brooks' face filled the screen. His mind didn't just see a man defending his mother, it saw a shareholder's nightmare. "Pull every policy file," he ordered sharply. "I want to know what excuse we even think we have." Legal counsel scrambled, flipping through regulations, searching desperately for language that could justify what the flight crew had done, but there was none. Nothing in their manuals permitted confiscating prescribed medicine. Nothing excused humiliating a passenger because of a bottle of pills. In the trading room, analysts were already reacting. Screens flashed red as airline stock tumbled within the hour. Investors sensitive to public outrage began unloading shares. "We can't hold this," one muttered to another. "You saw the video. This isn't just PR, this is liability." Reporters crowded the airport terminal, peppering spokespersons with questions. Why was her medicine thrown away? Is the airline aware her son is Adrian Brooks? What safeguards exist against discrimination? Every non-answer only fanned the flames. Inside the plane, passengers refreshed their feeds, stunned to see themselves already part of the news cycle. A man scrolled through comments. This could have been my grandmother. How many times has this happened without cameras? Finally, someone with power is holding them accountable. Evelyn sat quietly, her hand resting in her son's. Her eyes remained closed, but she heard the murmurs, the disbelief, the solidarity. After decades of quiet battles, her struggle had become a mirror for a nation still grappling with the simplest question: whose dignity matters? Adrian remained standing, his composure unshaken. When the captain approached again, his words were clipped. "Sir, operations is requesting you allow us to continue. They assure me the matter will be reviewed once we land." Adrian's response was firm. "Review it all you like, but my mother will not be carried as baggage to your corporate cover-up. This flight does not move until accountability begins here." The captain hesitated, then retreated once more, clearly aware he was no longer the ultimate authority in the cabin. In the boardroom, executives argued. Some pushed for immediate apology, others for silence until they understood the facts. But the facts were already written across millions of devices. A video of an elderly black woman stripped of her medicine, her billionaire son grounding an airline in defense of her humanity. Markets kept sliding. Television hosts dissected the issue, inviting activists and former airline employees to weigh in. One panelist said bluntly, "This isn't about a policy failure. This is about racial bias. Would they have treated an elderly white passenger with such disregard?" The silence that followed was damning. At the airport, reporters shouted over one another as word spread that Adrian Brooks was still on board, refusing to allow takeoff. Headlines updated in real time. Flight grounded. Billionaire demands justice for mother. And in living rooms across America, families watched with a mixture of shock and recognition. They had seen smaller versions of this story before, in waiting rooms, at checkouts, in classrooms. But this time the scales were different. This time, power was answering back. By the end of the afternoon, the airline had lost hundreds of millions in market value. By evening, calls for boycotts trended nationwide. Politicians issued statements, civil rights leaders gave interviews, and all the while, the cabin lights glowed dimly on the tarmac, passengers whispering to each other in awe that they were part of a turning point. One passenger summed it up as they glanced around the cabin, recording a final video for their followers. "We boarded expecting just another flight, but history boarded with us." By the next morning, the story was no longer about a single flight. It had become a national conversation. The videos had spread across every platform, clipped into highlight reels, dissected on talk shows, debated in living rooms. What began with one bottle of medicine now represented something much larger: the ongoing struggle of Black travelers facing discrimination, even in the most ordinary spaces. Commentators asked the same questions over and over. Why was Evelyn's word not enough? Why did the crew treat her prescription as contraband instead of protection? Why did it take the intervention of a billionaire son for the world to finally listen? Civil rights organizations responded quickly. Leaders reminded the public that Evelyn's humiliation was not unique. They pointed to decades of complaints from passengers of color, being pulled aside for extra questioning at security, being denied upgrades while white passengers received them, being labeled aggressive for raising valid concerns. The story had simply cracked open a wound that was already festering. Data supported the outrage. Studies showed that Black travelers were disproportionately reported for non-compliance on flights, often for minor issues like asking for different seating or questioning a delay. In customer service logs, complaints from Black passengers were less likely to be taken seriously. The numbers painted a grim picture. Racism didn't vanish at 30,000 feet, it boarded alongside everyone else. Passengers from Evelyn's flight began to speak publicly. One woman described the shame she felt watching the medicine being tossed away. Another man admitted he'd wanted to speak sooner, but stayed silent until Adrian arrived. Their testimonies carried weight, amplifying the sense that this was not just policy gone wrong, it was bias in plain sight. For Black viewers across the country, Evelyn's struggle was painfully familiar. Social media filled with stories: an elderly man forced to pour out his diabetes supplies at security, a mother accused of lying about her child's nut allergy, a student removed from a flight for attitude. The comments were united. We've been living this. The only difference is most of us don't have a billionaire to back us up. Adrian himself issued a short statement through his foundation. My mother was not the first black woman to be dismissed in public, and she will not be the last. But I will use every resource at my disposal to make sure no one else endures what she did on that plane. His words reverberated beyond finance and philanthropy. Activists called on regulators to investigate airline practices. Politicians pledged hearings. Advocacy groups organized campaigns under hashtags like #DignityInTheAir and Flying While Black. And yet, beneath the noise, Evelyn remained the quiet heart of it all. Her face, captured in those shaky phone videos, symbolized both fragility and unbreakable resolve. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't fought back with insults. She had simply endured, her dignity intact even as it was stripped from her. That, more than anything, unsettled people. The reminder that racism often wears the mask of professionalism, that humiliation can arrive wrapped in the language of policy. Passengers who had been silent during the confrontation now admitted their silence haunted them. One man wrote online, "I thought about my grandmother. I thought, what if it had been her? And I realized I should have stood up sooner." Another confessed, "We always think someone else will say something. This time it took her son. But what about the times when no one is there?" The bigger picture was unavoidable. Evelyn's ordeal was not just an isolated injustice. It was evidence of a system that devalued certain bodies and voices. It forced a question that could no longer be ignored. What does safety mean if it is used as a shield for prejudice? Airlines scrambled to reassure the public. Spokespersons promised reviews of protocol and renewed commitment to equity, but many saw through it. As one commentator put it bluntly on national television, this isn't about updating a handbook. This is about respecting humanity. And until airlines start seeing black passengers as equals, this will happen again. Evelyn herself, though weary, understood the weight of her story. To her, it wasn't about trending hashtags or stock prices. It was about every door she'd been pushed out of in her youth, every slight that told her she didn't belong. This time, the world had been forced to watch. And as Adrian had promised, silence was no longer an option. Days after the flight, Evelyn sat in a quiet hospital room, sunlight spilling through the blinds. Her chest no longer pounded with panic, though fatigue still lingered in her bones. The doctors assured her she was stable, that the stress had been the real danger. Adrian sat by her bedside, phone buzzing with non-stop calls, but his hand never left hers. "You shouldn't have had to endure that," he said softly. Evelyn only gave him a small smile, her eyes filled with the calm of someone who had faced storms before. The incident had sparked more than outrage. It had sparked a movement. Adrian's foundation announced a new initiative focused on passenger rights, particularly protecting elderly and vulnerable travelers from discrimination. He pledged millions to fund legal support for those who had been wronged and to lobby for stronger federal protections. No one, he said at the press conference, should have to choose between dignity and travel. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from across the country. A retired teacher in Georgia wrote, "Your mother gave me courage. I was humiliated years ago on a flight, and I stayed silent. Watching her reminded me I am not alone." A college student in Chicago shared, "My grandmother was treated the same way, and nobody cared. Thank you for making the world pay attention." Social media became a chorus of solidarity. Hashtags spread, carrying stories of passengers who had experienced similar treatment. What struck people most was Evelyn's composure, the way she had carried herself with grace, even as her humanity was questioned. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't raged, she had simply remained, a mirror to the cruelty around her. Civil rights groups rallied behind her. They invited Evelyn to speak, but she declined the spotlight. Instead, she allowed Adrian to use his influence, trusting that he would turn her ordeal into something lasting. "I've fought enough battles," she told him quietly. "This one is yours to carry." Adrian did more than carry it. He amplified it. He called for congressional hearings on racial bias in air travel. He demanded airlines undergo mandatory bias training for crew members. He used his platform not just to condemn, but to propose solutions. And because of who he was, the world had to listen. Yet even with his power, Adrian never let the focus shift from his mother. At every podium, in every interview, he reminded audiences, This began with a 72-year-old black woman who asked for nothing more than respect. Remember her name. Remember her face. Remember that she is one of millions. Back in her community, Evelyn returned to her routine slowly. Neighbors stopped by with flowers, with meals, with quiet words of admiration. "You gave us all strength," one woman told her. Evelyn only shook her head. "Strength comes from those who stand with you," she replied. At church the following Sunday, Evelyn was greeted with a standing ovation. She bowed her head, overwhelmed. For years, she had believed her battles belonged only to her generation. Now she saw that they still mattered, perhaps more than ever. Her story became a lesson told in classrooms, a case study in law schools, a rallying cry in activism circles. And for every retelling, the same truth rose to the surface. Injustice thrives in silence, but it crumbles when even one person dares to demand dignity. For Evelyn, the ordeal had been a wound, but for countless others, it became a call to action. "They tried to silence her," Adrian said at one of his speeches, his mother watching quietly from the front row. "Instead, they amplified her voice across the world." The cabin never took to the sky that day, but its story soared far beyond the runway. What began as a confrontation over a small bottle of pills became a turning point, not only for an airline, but for every silent injustice that had too often gone unseen. Evelyn's quiet endurance and Adrian's unwavering defense forced the world to look, to listen, to reckon. She carried more than medicine that day. She carried history and dignity no one could discard. Every humiliation she had endured in her lifetime gathered in that moment, and when the bottle was thrown away, the world finally saw what it meant to strip someone of their humanity under the cover of policy. The irony was clear. They had grounded her flight, but in truth, she had grounded a system. A system that had too often brushed aside the voices of black travelers, a system that assumed silence would protect it. Instead, Evelyn's story reminded the world that silence is never the end, it is only the beginning of resistance. Her son's power made headlines. Yes, his wealth and influence froze a corporation in its tracks. But what lingered in the hearts of those who watched wasn't only his authority, it was her resilience. A 72-year-old woman who had lived through segregation, humiliation, and prejudice, still sitting tall, still refusing to let anyone define her worth. For every passenger on that flight, the lesson was undeniable. Dignity denied to one is dignity denied to all. And for millions who later watched the story unfold on their phones, the message was even sharper. Racism doesn't need shouting to wound, and it doesn't need violence to scar. Sometimes it hides behind procedure. Sometimes it cloaks itself in professionalism. But the impact is always the same: a life made smaller, a person made to feel invisible. The world cannot afford to look away any longer. So now the question turns to you. What would you have done if you were on that flight? Would you have stayed silent in your seat? Or would you have stood for her dignity before her son arrived? Share your story in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from. Because stories like this one stretch beyond borders. They touch every community, every family, every person who has ever felt unseen. And if you believe stories like Evelyn's deserve to be heard, make sure you subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. Here we tell the truths too often buried, the struggles too often dismissed, and the victories that prove justice still has a voice. Because in the end, it was never just about medicine. It was about a woman who carried history in her hands, and a son who refused to let that history be disrespected. They grounded her flight, but she grounded a system.